In an era when a woman's ambition was often seen as a social failing, a personality flaw, Clare Boothe Luce collected careers like charms on a bracelet. She wasn't just a journalist. She was a star editor at the most fashionable magazine in the world. She wasn't just a playwright. She wrote one of the most successful and scandalous Broadway hits of the 1930s. And she wasn't just a politician. She was a firebrand congresswoman during the height of the Second World War, and later, America's first woman appointed to a major ambassadorial post. She moved through life with a relentless, almost terrifying velocity. Her wit was legendary, capable of cutting down a political opponent or a pompous socialite with a single, perfectly crafted phrase. She once famously said, "No good deed goes unpunished," a line so perfectly cynical it has been echoing ever since. But that polished, diamond-hard exterior, the one she so carefully constructed, was a shield. And in 1944, that shield would be pierced by a tragedy so absolute that it would expose the raw, vulnerable heart beneath, forcing her and us to ask a fundamental question. What is the point of conquering the world if you lose what you hold most dear? To truly understand Clare, you have to imagine the world that forged her. Picture the dawn of the 20th century, a time of dizzying, almost violent change. The world she was born into in 1903 was one of horse-drawn carriages and rigid Victorian morals, a world that still believed in fixed social orders and clearly defined roles. But the world of her youth was the Jazz Age, a whirlwind of flappers, speakeasies, and a thrilling, terrifying sense of modernity. It wasn't just a change in fashion, it was a fundamental shift in consciousness. The Great War had left a deep psychological chasm in its wake, shattering old certainties and creating a generation that felt both liberated and profoundly lost. There was a frantic energy in the air, a sense of living for the moment because tomorrow was no longer guaranteed. This was the soundtrack to Clare's childhood, the roar of new engines, the wail of a saxophone, and the crumbling of old traditions. It was an era of seismic shifts, a world grappling with the aftermath of one global war and bracing for the next. And at the heart of this change was the evolving role of women. Yes, women in America had only just secured the right to vote in 1920, a monumental victory that had been fought for over decades. But let's be clear, the right to mark a ballot did not magically erase centuries of social conditioning. The notion of a woman holding significant political power or commanding respect in male-dominated fields was still a radical, almost laughable one. The prevailing ideal was still that a woman's place was in the home, her success measured by the status of her husband and the perfection of her household. For the vast majority, career paths were narrowly defined. Teacher, nurse, secretary, shop girl. These were respectable, but they were jobs, not careers, and they were almost always abandoned upon marriage. Yet simmering just beneath the surface was a new kind of woman, the new woman, as they called her, educated, opinionated, and unwilling to be a mere accessory to a man's life. This was the fundamental conflict of the era, a new political freedom clashing with an old social reality, and it was into this confusing, contradictory, and electric atmosphere that Clare Boothe was thrust, a young girl with a fire in her belly and a mother determined to fan it into a blaze. This was the world Clare Boothe navigated. She wasn't born into the immense old money wealth of the Astors or the Vanderbilts, those families who resided in a fortress of inherited status. Instead, she was born into a comfortable, if perpetually precarious, middle-class background in New York City. And this is a crucial point. She was close enough to the glittering world of the super-rich to see it, to study it, to desire it, but she was not of it. She was an outsider with a front row seat, a position that breeds the sharpest observers. The architect of her early life, the driving force behind every decision, was her mother, Anna Clare Snyder. Anna was a former chorus girl with a vivacious spirit and a core of absolute steel. To understand Clare, you must first understand Anna. In that era, a chorus girl was a woman of ambition and grit, but one who existed on the fringes of respectable society. Anna had tasted the allure of the stage, but had been denied a leading role in life. So she transferred all of her thwarted ambition onto her brilliant daughter. Anna became the ultimate stage mother, not for Broadway, but for the great, glittering, ruthless game of society. She saw Clare's potential as a masterpiece in waiting and was determined that she would have the life Anna herself had only dreamed of. This meant a relentless focus on education, culture, and presentation. Anna scraped together money to send Clare on trips to Europe, ensuring she could speak French, appreciate art, and move with an easy grace that belied their unstable finances. She taught Clare how to dress, how to talk, how to charm, and most importantly, how to listen, to understand the unspoken currents of power in any room. In stark contrast to this constant driving maternal presence was the vacuum left by her father. William Franklin Booth was a musician and a restless, charming, but ultimately unreliable spirit. He was a violinist, a salesman, a man of many schemes and few successes. His presence in her life was intermittent, a fleeting source of affection, but never of stability. He and Anna eventually divorced, a scandalous event for the time, which plunged the family into an even more financially vulnerable position. The psychological impact of this on young Clare cannot be overstated. From her father, she learned that charm was fleeting and that male promises were often hollow. His absence created a deep-seated need for security, a conviction that she could rely on no one but herself. Her later drive for financial independence and her attraction to men of immense power and substance can be seen as a direct reaction to the instability her father represented. She would spend her life ensuring she would never again be at the mercy of a charming but unreliable man. This early life, marked by constant movement, financial uncertainty, and the constant need to adapt, was her true education. The family moved frequently, and Clare was shuttled between different schools and boarding houses. This nomadic existence prevented her from forming deep roots, but perfected her skills as a social chameleon. It inadvertently forged the adaptable, resilient, and fiercely independent woman she would become. She learned how to enter a new environment, quickly assess its social hierarchy, and find her place within it. From this precarious perch, she observed the world with a keen, almost surgical eye. She absorbed the nuances of class, the hypocrisy of high society, and the complex dance of human relationships. She was developing the raw material for her future plays, filing away the vanities, insecurities, and ambitions of the people she met. So, from a very young age, she learned a cold and vital lesson. Security was not a given. It was not something you were born with. It had to be seized. It could be earned through talent and hard work, or, as was the more common and accepted path for a beautiful woman of her time, it could be married into. For Clare, it would be both. This pragmatic, almost cynical understanding of the world became her guiding principle. It wasn't about finding a soulmate. It was about securing her position, building a fortress of wealth and status around herself, so that the precariousness of her childhood could never touch her again. She was a woman who would not be confined by the drawing room expectations of her time, because she had seen firsthand how fragile that world could be. She was being groomed and was grooming herself for a much, much grander stage. Clare's ascent was nothing short of meteoric, and it began not with a grand plan, but with a strategic marriage. At the age of 20, she married George Tuttle Brokaw, a millionaire socialite 23 years her senior. On the surface, it was a spectacular success. She was suddenly mistress of a Fifth Avenue mansion, draped in jewels and furs. But the reality was stifling. Brokaw was an alcoholic, and the glittering cage of high society was intellectually barren for a woman of Clare's sharp mind. The marriage produced one child, a daughter named Anne, but it was deeply unhappy. After 6 years, Clare did something that was still quite scandalous for a woman of her social standing. She filed for divorce. She walked away with a significant settlement, which for the first time in her life gave her something she craved even more than status: financial independence. She was now free to forge her own path, and forge it she did. She set her sights on the vibrant, competitive world of journalism and publishing. She got a job at Vogue, and then, through sheer talent and relentless drive, moved to Vanity Fair, the intellectual and cultural nerve center of New York. Under the legendary editor Frank Crowninshield, she blossomed. She started by writing photo captions and quickly rose to become the magazine's managing editor by 1933. Can you imagine the sheer audacity and brilliance required for a woman to achieve that in the early 1930s? She was commissioning articles from the greatest minds of the age: Aldous Huxley, Colette, Noel Coward, while sharpening her own distinctive voice. Her writing was incisive, witty, and utterly fearless. But Clare wasn't content merely to observe and edit. She wanted to create. She turned her formidable talents to playwriting, and it was on Broadway that she truly cemented her reputation as a cultural force. After a few initial attempts, she struck gold with The Women in 1936. What a phenomenon that play was. It featured a cast of over 40 actors, all of them female. Not a single man appeared on stage. The play was a deliciously satirical and often vicious look at the lives of Park Avenue socialites, their affairs, their gossip, their backstabbing, and their ultimate dependence on men. Critics were divided. Some found it scandalous and cynical, but audiences adored it. It was a smash hit, running for over 600 performances and being adapted into a major Hollywood film. The Women wasn't just entertainment. It was a piece of biting social commentary, revealing Clare's early inclination to challenge the status quo and dissect the power dynamics of her world. It was during this period of incredible success that she met her intellectual and ambitious match, Henry "Harry" Luce, the powerful founder of the media empire that included Time, Life, and Fortune magazines. Theirs was a true power couple marriage. He was gruff, brilliant, and arguably the most influential publisher in America. She was glamorous, witty, and a celebrated author. Together, they were an unstoppable force. The marriage instantly catapulted her into the very upper echelons of American power and influence. It gave her an unparalleled platform, but it was a platform she was more than capable of building herself. Their dinner parties were legendary, gatherings of world leaders, artists, and thinkers. Yet, their relationship was famously tempestuous, a clash of two titanic egos. They argued ferociously about politics, religion, and everything in between, but they shared a deep, if complicated, bond and a mutual respect for each other's intellect. With Harry's encouragement and her own insatiable curiosity, Clare pivoted again, this time to war correspondence. As the storm clouds of World War II gathered over Europe, she traveled extensively, reporting from England, France, Italy, and China. Her journalistic dispatches were not the dry factual accounts of many of her male colleagues. They were vivid, personal, and insightful, showcasing her courage and her ability to grasp complex international affairs. She was nearly killed during a bombing raid in Belgium and wrote with chilling clarity about the rise of fascism. These experiences solidified her reputation as a serious intellectual, not just a socialite or a playwright. She wasn't just observing history anymore. She was on its front lines, increasingly determined to shape its outcome. Then came the most audacious pivot of all, politics. Driven by a fierce anti-isolationist stance and a deep conviction that America needed to confront the growing fascist aggression, Clare decided to run for Congress in 1942, representing Connecticut's 4th District. The political establishment was aghast. A woman, a playwright, a glamorous socialite. She was dismissed as a lightweight, a dilettante. But her opponents gravely underestimated her. She was a brilliant and tireless campaigner, using her sharp wit to disarm critics and her deep knowledge of foreign affairs to command respect. And she won. She arrived in Washington, D.C. like a comet. She was a Republican, a conservative, yet her very presence was revolutionary. As a congresswoman, she was a fierce and often controversial debater, known for her sharp tongue and unwavering principles. In her very first speech, she coined the term global oni, mocking Vice President Henry Wallace's idealistic vision for post-war aviation policy, arguing instead for a more pragmatic, America-first approach. The speech caused a national sensation. Some hailed it as brilliant, others decried it as cynical isolationism. But no one could ignore her. She advocated for a strong military, for American leadership on the global stage, and for a tough stance against both fascism and later communism. She wasn't afraid to challenge anyone, earning both powerful admirers and equally powerful enemies. Her speeches were legendary, delivered with a theatrical flair honed on Broadway, but underpinned by rigorous intellect. She served 2 terms, making her mark as a formidable legislator and a vocal advocate for her beliefs. It was during this period of intense public service, at the absolute zenith of her power and influence, that her carefully constructed world would be irrevocably, brutally shattered. The year was 1944. World War II raged across the globe, and Clare Boothe Luce was a central figure in American political life, a whirlwind of energy and intellect. She was a prominent voice in the national conversation, dedicating her boundless energy to the war effort, advising on policy, and using her formidable platform to rally the nation. Her days were a blur of high-stakes meetings, strategic debates on the House floor, and urgent cables about the fate of the free world. But all of that, the noise and the fury of her public life, would fall silent at the sound of a single voice. Her personal life held a joy that transcended all political triumphs. A single brilliant point of light. Her only child, Anne Clare Brokaw. Anne, now a vivacious and intelligent 19-year-old, was the absolute center of Clare's universe, the cherished daughter from her first marriage. She was, quite simply, everything to Clare. For a woman who was so often described by others and even by herself as cool, calculating, and emotionally guarded, her love for Anne was a fierce, all-consuming fire. It was perhaps the one truly unguarded part of her heart. In the world of politics and publishing, Clare wore armor. With Anne, she was just a mother, fiercely proud and deeply devoted. Anne was a freshman at Stanford University in California, a world away from the political cauldron of Washington, D.C. She was a bright, popular young woman with her whole life stretching out before her. While she had inherited her mother's striking looks and intelligence, she possessed a quieter, gentler spirit. Where Clare was a storm, Anne was a gentle breeze. Their relationship, forged in the wake of Clare's divorce and her subsequent whirlwind career, was intensely close. They wrote to each other constantly, their letters filled with a mix of maternal advice and a daughter's updates on classes, friends, and dances. Anne was the grounding force in Clare's often tumultuous existence. No matter how vicious the political battle, no matter how demanding her schedule, a letter or a phone call from Anne was an anchor to what truly mattered. While Clare was taking Washington by storm, debating the future of the world, Anne was in sunny California, embarking on her own promising future, studying history and navigating the joys and anxieties of college life. The war, for all its horrors overseas, brought with it a different, more insidious kind of danger to the American home front. Petrol rationing that led people to drive on worn-out tires, nighttime blackout conditions that shrouded roads in darkness, and a general strain on infrastructure as all resources were poured into the war effort. It was a time of shared national purpose, but also of hidden domestic risks. It was on a dark, wet January night in 1944, just as Anne was being driven back to Stanford, after a Christmas break with a friend, that tragedy struck. Think about the simple, mundane reality of that moment. A young woman full of life chatting with a friend, perhaps talking about the semester ahead, the car humming along a familiar stretch of road near San Mateo. And then, in an instant, the world ended. An oncoming car, its driver reportedly blinded by the dim, legally mandated wartime headlights of another vehicle, swerved erratically and without warning directly into their path. A senseless, violent, head-on collision. Anne, sitting in the passenger seat, was killed instantly. There was no warning, no time to react, just a brutal mechanical finality. The news reached Clare in her office in Washington, D.C. Imagine the scene. The heart of American power, papers piled high, the hum of a nation at war just outside her window. And then the telephone rings. It wasn't a call from the president or a fellow member of Congress. It arrived not with a gentle warning, but as a brutal, unimaginable blow delivered down a crackling long-distance line. The titan of Congress, the woman who could silence a room with a single perfectly timed word, was rendered completely and utterly broken. In that single moment, the entire artifice of her power, her fame, and her influence collapsed into nothing. It was a moment that tore a permanent chasm in her soul. This wasn't just a loss. It was an amputation of her very being. For a woman who had conquered so many worlds, journalism, theater, politics, this was the one enemy she could not defeat, the one wound that would never, ever heal. Witnesses and close friends from that time described Clare as utterly devastated, a ghost of her former self. Her husband, Harry Luce, flew immediately to her side, but he too was at a loss. A man used to solving problems, who was now faced with an inconsolable, unfixable sorrow. The formidable congresswoman vanished, replaced by a grief-stricken mother. The artist Dorothy Hale, a close friend, recalled finding Clare in a state of near catatonic shock, unable to speak, simply staring into space for hours on end. The woman who was accustomed to control, to shaping outcomes, to bending the world to her will, was now utterly, terrifyingly powerless. She was trapped in a nightmare from which there was no escape. The political arena, with its grand pronouncements and strategic battles, the world to which she had dedicated her life, suddenly seemed like a cruel, meaningless joke. What was the point of winning legislative victories or shaping public opinion if the most precious part of her life was gone forever? Just weeks before, she had been engaged in fierce debates about post-war policy. Now, the fate of nations seemed like a triviality compared to the deafening silence in her heart. Her fiery wit, her cutting intellect, her relentless political ambition, all of it seemed to falter and die under the unbearable weight of her grief. For a time she tried to carry on, to find solace in the familiar routines of her work. She returned to the floor of Congress, a specter in black, her face an impenetrable mask of sorrow. Her colleagues, unsure of what to say, would offer awkward condolences, their words of sympathy feeling like pebbles thrown into an abyss. She would nod politely, but those who knew her saw a profound and permanent change. The brilliant sparkle in her eyes was gone, dimmed by an ocean of unshed tears. Her formidable posture was now subtly stooped, as if by an invisible, crushing burden. She pushed forward, but it was with a spirit bruised, broken, and utterly lost. A friend recounted visiting her home and finding her standing motionless before a large portrait of Anne, talking to her as if she were still in the room, her voice choked with sobs, asking unanswerable questions to an oil and canvas likeness. She had conquered the world, but she had lost her daughter, and in that moment she had lost everything that mattered. The foundation of her life had turned to dust. The aftermath of Anne's death was not just a period of mourning. It was a profound and total transformation of Clare's inner world, a demolition of the self she had so carefully constructed. The woman who had always relied on her razor-sharp intellect and indomitable will found herself completely adrift in a silent gray ocean of grief. Her logical, often cynical mind, which could dissect a political problem with surgical precision, went to war with itself. It struggled violently to comprehend such an arbitrary, meaningless, and cruel loss. There was no logic to it, no reason, no one to blame. It was just a void, an absolute negation of everything she understood about cause and effect. For months, she was locked in this internal battle, her formidable mind trying to find a logical foothold in a situation that was pure, senseless tragedy. She searched desperately for answers, for meaning, for some kind of solace in the wreckage of her life. This agonizing quest led her down a completely unexpected path, one that would have seemed utterly improbable for the worldly, skeptical Clare of just a few years earlier. She began a deep dive into spirituality, reading voraciously the ancient philosophers, the great theologians, the mystics, searching for a framework that could contain her pain. This spiritual journey eventually led her to a charismatic and brilliant Roman Catholic priest who was making waves in America with his radio broadcasts, Monsignor Fulton J. Sheen. Sheen was an intellectual powerhouse, a theologian who could debate philosophy with the world's leading atheists as easily as he could explain the gospel to millions of listeners. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of spiritual guide who could appeal to Clare's formidable questioning mind. She wasn't looking for someone to pat her hand and offer platitudes. She was looking for an intellectual equal who could help her make sense of the unthinkable. Their conversations, which took place over many months, were not about blind faith, but about reason, theology, and the great agonizing questions of life, death, and suffering. Imagine the intellectual wrestling match, Clare, with her rapier wit and deep-seated skepticism, pushing back, questioning every premise, and Sheen, with his profound knowledge and calm certainty, meeting every challenge. He didn't offer her simple comforts. He engaged her intellect, challenging her to see a divine order in the chaos of human existence, to see suffering not as a cosmic mistake, but as a profound mystery. For Clare, the core appeal of Catholicism was this very combination of intellectual rigor and profound mystery, and most importantly, its unwavering belief in the afterlife. This is the key. The promise that she might one day be reunited with Anne was not just a comforting idea, it was a lifeline, a sliver of light in an otherwise unbearable and eternal darkness. In 1946, after 2 years of intense study and soul-searching, Clare Boothe Luce, the sharp-tongued wit and political operator, was formally received into the Roman Catholic Church. This wasn't a casual dalliance with faith or a temporary comfort. It was a profound, life-altering commitment. This conversion marked a fundamental reorientation of her entire being. While she completed her second term in Congress, she was a changed woman. The political battles no longer held the same allure. The firebrand who had burst onto the scene with her Global One speech was gone, replaced by a more reflective, somber figure. The glorious game of power, as she sometimes called it, now felt trivial, like a noisy children's game, compared to the eternal questions that consumed her. She found that the cut and thrust of partisan politics, the victories and defeats, offered no answers to the pain that lived in her heart. It was a quieter, more introspective, and spiritually focused Clare who eventually chose not to seek re-election in 1946, signaling a significant shift away from the political limelight she had once so eagerly embraced. She was stepping off the stage not in defeat, but in search of something more enduring than applause or power. Her later life, while still remarkable, was fundamentally different in its tone and purpose. For several years she wrote and reflected, but the world of public service called to her once more. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower, recognizing her still formidable intellect and experience, appointed her as the U.S. ambassador to Italy. It was a groundbreaking appointment, making her the first American woman to hold such a high-profile diplomatic post. In this role, she proved just as formidable and effective as she had ever been. But her methods had changed. She skillfully navigated the complex, high-stakes politics of Cold War Italy, a nation grappling with a powerful communist party, and successfully negotiated a settlement to the thorny Trieste border dispute with Yugoslavia. She was a glamorous and effective diplomat, a symbol of American strength, but beneath the surface, she was a changed woman. One of the more bizarre and telling episodes from her time in Rome was the arsenic poisoning incident. She fell seriously ill, suffering from fatigue, hair loss, and anemia. For a time, she became convinced that she was being slowly poisoned by her enemies, perhaps communist agents, through arsenic-laced paint chips falling from the ornate ceiling of her bedroom. An investigation later suggested the cause was more likely industrial pollution, but the incident revealed a woman still wrestling with a world she perceived as hostile and dangerous. Having lost her daughter to a random, inexplicable event, her traumatized psyche may have been searching for a tangible villain, a way to explain the constant threat of loss that she now felt so acutely. Even at the pinnacle of international diplomacy, the shadow of her loss remained. This is the great paradox of her later life. Her personal tragedy gave her a new kind of strength. Those who worked with her noted a new depth, a profound capacity for empathy that had perhaps been less apparent in her earlier, more combative years. Her own suffering had cracked her armor, opening a door to understanding the suffering of others. She became a prolific writer on Catholic themes, and while she remained a staunch anti-communist and a fierce advocate for conservative principles, her public persona was now tempered by a profound spiritual depth. She often spoke of Anne, not with bitterness, but with a wistful longing and a steadfast belief in a spiritual continuity that transcended death. The woman who had once been defined by her relentless ambition and razor-sharp wit now also carried a profound spiritual wisdom, born from the crucible of unimaginable sorrow. The historical conversation around Clare Boothe Luce is as complex and contradictory as the woman herself. For decades, she was celebrated for her wit, glamour, and groundbreaking career. However, a more nuanced debate questions the nature of her ferocious ambition. How much of her drive was a shield she wore to prove her worth in a society that patronized women? Many scholars suggest her aggressive intellectualism and caustic wit were coping mechanisms, a preemptive strike using her intellect as both a sword and a shield. On a public level, her legacy is one of a trailblazer who shattered glass ceilings in journalism, theater, politics, and diplomacy. She didn't imitate men. She weaponized her glamour and wit, proving femininity was a source of power. By sheer force of will, she forced the world to reconsider its narrow definitions of a woman's role, becoming, in spite of her fierce individualism, a blueprint for female ambition in a male-dominated world. Yet to focus only on her public triumphs is to miss the central heartbreaking truth of her life. The loss of her daughter Anne in a car accident was a tragedy that overshadowed every achievement. Her story becomes a powerful testament that external success, the fame, wealth, and power she had won, cannot insulate us from internal pain. This private grief became her most profound public lesson. It didn't just break her, it broke her open, transforming her relentless ambition for power into a desperate search for spiritual meaning and faith. The grief that remade her forces us to acknowledge the fragile human heart beneath every polished public persona. Her remarkable life came to a peaceful end on October 9th, 1987, at the age of 84. She died in her Watergate apartment in Washington, D.C., from a brain tumor, a clear and medically documented cause. In a life filled with fierce political battles and public debate, her death, by contrast, was entirely free of controversy or mystery. The public conversation at the time was not about the circumstances of her passing, but a final sweeping assessment of her staggering legacy. Friends and foes alike debated her political impact, her trailblazing role for women, and the profound transformative power of the personal tragedy that had redefined her decades earlier. Her passing was not another chapter of conflict, but a quiet closing of the book, leaving the world to marvel at the sheer volume and complexity of the story within. Ultimately, Clare Boothe Luce's story is one of dazzling contrasts, brilliant wit and searing sorrow, worldly power, and deep private faith. She reminds us that the greatest and most meaningful battles are often fought not in the halls of Congress or on the stages of Broadway, but within the quiet chambers of the human heart. Her life is a poignant, unforgettable lesson that true strength lies not in conquering the world, but in finding the courage to transform our deepest grief into a renewed sense of purpose.